Welcome my dear students in our Bangla Shiksha Classroom 2024. It is an endeavor of State Education Department, Government of West Bengal and Paschim Bango Samagra Shiksha Mission. I am Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya, Headmaster Hare School. Now, today we are going to take up a lesson of English, lesson number 12 of class 8. The immediate title of the topic is Someone. It is a poem by Walter John de la Mare. You know that he was a famous poet, British poet, and he was born in the year 25th April 1873 and he died in the year 1956 on 22nd June. The poet is widely known for his works for children. So you come to know that the poet had a special love for the children and he wrote for the children and he tried to depict the world of the children. And in many of his poems, children have a great role to play, and he wanted to establish in his poems that children have a different world, and that world is not, say, like the world of the elderly ones, that means the adult people. And in his poems we find another thing, that is the dominant features of nature. His notable works are Songs of Childhood, Mr. Bumps and His Monkey, The Listeners, Ding Dong Bell, etc. All these are poems. Now, besides being a poet of a great fame, he was also a novelist and also wrote many short stories, and his works for the children earned him fame, and children across the globe like to read his poems, and his poems depict different worlds, and the worlds have their benign coexistence. For example, man and nature. Most of the poems are basically fraught with pictures and say pictorial descriptions and narratives of man's say experiences in the midst of nature and nature's bounty, nature's different aspects, celestial beauty, mystery, suspense, all these things are there in his poems. So he is a poet who is studied, who is read across the globe. Now, here in this poem, let us come to the salient features of the poem. Role of nature is almost everywhere in this poem we find the role of nature. The poems are very much fraught with pictorial descriptions with varied characters having active or passive roles. And there also is the presence of mystery and suspense. Presence of mystery and suspense. These two words are very much predominant in his poems. If you study all the poems or any poem by Walter de la Mare, you will come to know that there is a sort of mystery and suspense throughout the poem, and it will say engross you in the poem, in the lines. If you read between the lines, you will find different layers of mystery, different types of experiences. Sometimes they are thrilling, adventuresome, etc. And then we find in this poem immediately the presence of subhuman creatures as supernatural creatures. Supernatural creatures meaning the creatures which are not in the world of human beings. They are subhuman creatures, they are airy creatures, say for example ghosts, so maybe then there are fairies, etc. So they are called supernatural creatures. Supernatural elements are thus introduced in his poems. And say a poem which is called The Listeners, which is very much close to this poem, has also the same type of mystery and suspense, and there are subhuman creatures, there is a horse, and now in this poem there are different characters. Now let us have a close look and let us read the poems. Someone came knocking at my wee small door, someone came knocking. So in these lines the poet is emphasizing that someone came knocking, and this someone is unidentified character. You see that the poet never say clarifies to the readers who is the someone, who is the someone. That someone came knocking, and it was at the small door of the poet. So, came knocking from outside. So, the unidentified character is somewhat ghostly, somewhat unknown to the readers, to the poet himself also. Someone came knocking, the line, first line is repeated in the third line again, and this repetition is to hammer the idea in the mind of the readers also. So, we the readers here are also a kind of listeners, We are listeners like the poet. When we read the poem, we are the extended listeners, and the poet makes it very much clear and emphatic that someone came knocking. When? At night. When you come to the text later on, we will explain all the lines. And now we come to the fourth line, where the poet asserts that someone came knocking and he was very much sure about it, or he was very much certain that someone came knocking. And the poet here finds that the person or anyone who came knocking is not, say, present, because in the next line he says, I listened, I opened. After listening to the sound of knocking, he opened the door. So, he is full of actions. He is listening, and at the same time he is opening the door. He looked outside, he looked to the left direction, he looked to the right direction, but not there was a stirring. Not meaning nothing. There was no stirring, nothing was there visible, present, and the poet finds that it was in the still dark night something mysterious. It was a kind of mysterious experience to the poet, and this mystery is also spreading through the lines in the minds of the readers. You my students, we all readers, we come to know that there was a kind of still darkness, and penetrating the darkness, he heard some kind of, say, knocking sound by someone who is not present, who is not visible. Only inside the room, only the busy beetle is present in the room of the poet, and it is making a kind of tapping sound in the wall. It is a kind of sound, tapping sound made by the beetle in the wall, and this is the indoor experience of the poet. And the outdoor experience of the poet is the still dark night. It is full of suspense and mystery, and in all his poems we find that in the poem the listeners, we also find, for example, we find in the listeners the ghostly presence of the ghosts who were standing on the stairs, and here outside there is none. So, it creates a sense of mystery in the mind of the readers. It creates a sense of mind in it creates a sense of, say, suspense in the mind of the poet himself also. Tapping sound, this sound is made by the beetle, and this sound is inside the room, and the beetle is visible, the sound is audible. So, the agent who is making the sound is the beetle, and the beetle is busy in its own way making a sound, and the poet is very much certain that the beetle is making the sound. But again the poet goes back to forest, and our attention is drawn to the forest. Now, the poet describes the forest. Only from the forest there are sounds. What sounds? The screech owl's call. Now, you see here screech owl's call. Screech owl is a kind of owl which is generally or traditionally accepted as of good luck, good luck. Good luck is associated with screech owl, whatever that may be. The screech owl's call, the word call is generally associated with human beings. Human beings call someone. So, human attribute is here, or human quality is here established or invested on screech owl. Screech owl is a kind of subhuman creature. The subhuman creature is here screech owl, and this screech owl is calling. It owls, generally we know owls hoot, not call. A man calls another man. So, person's quality is invested on the owl's character. So, this is a kind of use in poetry, in say poems. Poets generally use this type of words in order to give some human qualities on subhuman creatures, on any ideas, and this is called personification. That means person's qualities are attributed on someone. It is called personification. So, owl's call, besides owl's call, there is another kind of sound, only the cricket whistling. So, we find here the word only repeated in the very opening of some lines, only the busy beetle, only from the forest, only the cricket's whistling. So, the cricket is whistling. Cricket is a kind of insect, and that is making a whistling sound, and this whistling sound is very sharp sound, and it also intensifies the mystery, sense of mystery. Owl's call, hooting call, and the cricket's whistling, these are very much full of suspense and a kind of mystery. So, the environment of mystery is created in the forest outside, and the poet develops such mystery, such sense of suspense in the mind of the readers very easily with the use of very simple words, very simple descriptions, very simple say pictorial descriptions and images. And then in the midst of the sounds created by the owl and the cricket, we find that the dewdrops fall is taking place, and the sound of falling of dewdrops is almost inaudible. That means we cannot listen to it because of the presence of these two other sounds, owl's call and the whistling of the cricket. So, it is almost a kind of inaudible sound, and that is the sound of dewdrops. And here in the idea of dewdrops falling, we find another thing, reference to a kind of say time, and that time is usually winter time when dewdrops fall. So, here we find also another say natural aspect, that is winter time. We found that it was still dark night, and we found that in the midst of say mystery and suspense, the poet is placed. So, the poet comes to the concluding section, concluding lines. So, I know not who came knocking. So, I know not. Now, the poet clearly, specifically, categorically says that I know not. It is an emphatic statement, negative emphatic statement, where he comes to the conclusion that I know not who came knocking, and that emphasis is more established with reinforcement, with say more stress in the last line, which is just thrice repetition of the word at all, the words at all, at all, at all. So, the poet is at all clear, the poet is clear that at all someone came knocking, and I know not who came. I know not who came knocking at my small door. I know not who came knocking. And now we will come to the brief analysis of the poem. Now this is the structural aspect. In the structural aspect, we will find out that the poem is a small one, having 16 small lines, and it is a lyric poem. Predominantly the speaker is the poet himself, and he himself is the listener. But the poem has another quality, that is the dramatic aspect. The poem has a dramatic aspect. The situation is there, a nocturnal situation is there, nocturnal creatures are there, and say these creatures are owl, then there is a beetle inside the room, and outside there is the sound of the cricket. So the owl, cricket, all these are nocturnal characters present in the poem. And the speaker is the poet himself. He is also the listener. So he is also the listener, and we, the readers, are the extended listeners. Extended meaning, when we are reading this poem, we have also a role. We are entering deep into the lines of the poem, and we read the lines very clearly. We experience like the poet himself, and as if we are also listening to the sounds of the owl, and we also feel the sense of suspense and mystery when we read this poem. Now, we also have here different oppositions of ideas and concepts. Now, we find that outside in the nature there is a kind of situation, and inside the room there is a kind of situation. Inside the room we find the presence of the poet and the beetle, which is making tap-tapping sound, and outside in the nature we find the owl, screech owl, making its call, and we also find there a kind of cricket which is making whistling sound. Now, then there is the opposition between specific and non-specific. Specific, the character of the poet is specific, the poet is the speaker and the listener, and non-specific, the someone who came knocking at the door. Then there is the opposition between static and dynamic concepts. Static, the night is still, night is static, and dynamic and active, the speaker, the subhuman creatures like the owl, the beetle, the cricket. They are dynamic. They are doing some, dynamic means they are engaged in some kind of work. They are actively participating in some work. Then there is the opposition between certain and uncertain. Now, certain means sure. The poet makes it very much clear in the fourth line, I am sure, sure, sure. He is sure of something, and at the end of the poem, in the poet's words, we find I know not. That means uncertain. He is uncertain. Who came? Who is that someone? Who came knocking? He is uncertain. I know not. Then there is the worlds of macrocosm and microcosm. Macrocosm, that means the natural surroundings, the forest itself, the owl and the other creatures, they are there, and the night is dark and still night outside. Outside natural surroundings is here macrocosm. And inside the room, inside the poet's walls and door, we find the microcosmic world. So the poet develops here two types of worlds, macrocosm and microcosm. Small door and in the wall, these two words develop the microcosm. Then from the point of view of structure, we come to the analysis of the lines, lines with rhymes and lines without rhymes. I will take up the explanation later on, but before that I come to the say next point, that is sound. Sound, two types of sounds are there. One is sound audible, that is heard, we can hear, that is coming from the different agents, knocking, someone knocking, tap tapping, crickets whistling, owls call, these are the sounds, audible sounds. We listen to it, we hear it. But on the other hand, sound inaudible, that means unheard sound. We cannot hear it, but there is a sound, but it is almost inaudible, and that is dewdrops fall. The sound of falling of dewdrops, that is inaudible. Now, the characters present in the poem, what are the characters? Predominantly the character of the poet or the speaker and the listener, and then someone who is an unidentified character, and thereafter we find three characters which are present, characters of say of the world which does not belong to the world of human beings, and they are beetle, screech owl and cricket. Screech owl and cricket are outside in the nature, and somehow the beetle got entry in the room of the poet, and it is making some sound in the wall. Now, next we will take up the rhyming lines. Rhyming lines are there. If you take up your text, then you will find then the rhyming lines are ing sound is available in the lines ending with ing sound in the lines 1, 3, 7, 13 and 15, and it is simulating a type of action, it is creating a kind of action. It suggests ing, when we add with the main verb ing, we say use it to describe some action going on. So it is a kind of say sound, ing sound, which also hammers in our ears, and we come to know that something is going on. That means action is going on. So this say brings in the concept of dynamicity of the poem. The poet describes something dynamic, and then we find lines having different rhymes. Different rhymes are introduced in 2 and 4 lines. Second line and fourth line we have the same rhyme. Again in 6th and 8th line we have the same rhyme, and thereafter in the lines 10, 12, 14 and 16 we have different types of rhymes. The same rhyme is repeated also here in these 4 lines, and the absence of rhyme in the lines 5, 9 and 11. In these 3 lines, the absence of any kind of rhyme has a jarring effect on the readers. Jarring effect meaning it gives you a jerk, as if a kind of halt, and it intensifies the note of suspense and mystery throughout the poem. Throughout the poem we find that. So the abundant use of ing in the rhyme, knocking, stirring, tap tapping, whistling, this suggests that the action is going on. And the types of sound, thereafter we come to the types of sound. The sharp sound created by knocking, screech owl's call, crickets whistling, beetles tap tapping, etc. Soft sound, fall of the dewdrops. We discussed it a few minutes ago, the types of sound, explained it. Now, figure of speech, we have also say described the or we have also say explained the personification, figure of speech, and alliteration, another figure of speech. So, if you have say the idea of explaining the poem from the point of view of figures of speech used here in the poem, you will find that personification is predominantly present here and alliteration is also there. Now, we come to the word nest. Word nest, that means some meanings of the words. We, very small. So, very small or small in size here. Knocking, making sound to draw someone's attention. So, to draw the attention, we are knocking at the door, or knocking at the mind, etc. we call it. Listening, hearing attentively. Not, nothing. Not, it is the poetic use. Generally, we use nothing in prose, but in some poems, some poets use the archaic use, archaic meaning old use of the word nothing is not. It is a poetic use. Stirring, physical movement. Here a beetle, a kind of insect that is making a movement, and that is sound, a tapping sound, that is stirring here. And the screech owl, a few minutes ago we discussed that screech owl is very much auspicious and a kind of bird which brings in good luck. Generally it is the traditional belief. And whistling. Whistling is a sharp sound made by the cricket, an insect. Now, in this poem we find a kind of philosophical note. What is the philosophical note? That means we have a kind of philosophical realization, thinking that knocking is symbolic enough. Knocking itself is symbolic enough to suggest that death is knocking at the door, or knocking as a reminder to the fact that we all will have to live this mortal life. So, it is knocking, not physically always, say knocking at the door is not physically say present. As for example, in this poem knocking is not say recognized because the poet cannot find anyone knocking. So, maybe it is the imagination of the poet, maybe it has the philosophical say idea in the background that we all will have to leave this world and death is knocking at the door, or it may be the knocking of the conscience, the human conscience. So, we come to the say idea, come to the concept that the poem has a say kind of philosophical lesson or philosophical teaching also. Now, from the point of view of aesthetics or aesthetic idea, we will say explain that the poet here develops a very serene, a very beautiful nocturnal picture outside in the nature. Though there are some kind of say elements of suspense and mystery, yet it is a kind of serene, still picture of the night during some winter time, and the poet experiences it and takes us to this world of nature. So, the human world and the world of nature, these are say beautifully made mingled or amalgamated in this poem. That means there is a beautiful mixture, there is a beautiful blend of two different worlds. So, this has an aesthetic appeal to all the readers. So, let us come to some questions. The following questions are to be answered in brief. Who came knocking and where? What was the listener's reaction to the knocking? What is the meaning of the line, but not there was a stirring? N-O-U-G-H-T. Not there was a stirring. How has the poet described the night in the poem? What sound did the poet listen to inside the room? What sounds in the forest did the poet listen to? What time of the year is suggested in the poem? What is certain to the poet? What figures of speech have been used in the poem? Explain. So, we find that in this poem we have different aspects, and these questions are very simple questions. I think you all will be able to answer these questions. Who came knocking and where? You know, someone came knocking and it is in the poet's door. What was the listener's reaction to the knocking? The poet listened to it, opened the door, saw left and right, found none. This is the immediate reaction of the poet or the listener. Then what is the meaning of the line, but not there was a stirring? The meaning is that there was no stirring outside, the night was still, night was dark, and none was visible outside. Next question, how has the poet described the night in the poem? The poet has described the night as still and dark, silent. Otherwise, the poet would have said something else. The two words still and dark, these two words are very much emphatic to describe the night. What sound did the poet listen to inside the room? The beetle sound, you know. What time of the year is suggested in the poem? The dewdrops fall suggest that it is a winter time. What is certain to the poet? The poet is certain that none came knocking at his door at all. These three repetition of the word at all, words at all, thrice clarifies that the poet was certain that no one came to knock at his door. What figures of speech are there in the poem? The figures of speech are personification and also the alliteration. So, I think all of you have come to understand this poem, and I extend my thanks to all of you for participating in this program of Banglar Shiksha Classroom 2024, organized by, and it is an endeavor of State Education Department and Samagro Shiksha Mission Paschim Bongo under the Government of West Bengal. Thank you all again.